been an interesting couple of weeks for our family, and I actually had the great opportunity to stay in a really nice hotel last night. It's called Patricia Neal Hospital. Sleeping on just a beautiful, beautiful thermopedic piece of cardboard, and so, but I've noticed something in the process of being in that place. Is this dance between dignity and depravity that takes place all the time. Without going into any graphic details, there have been moments where in our own hospital room, Skylar is somewhat exposed physically to the whole world and to all the nurses and everybody that comes in. And then 30 seconds later, he wants the dignity of being covered up, or to be, it's like, wait a minute, we were, the same people were just in here, we were just doing this, and it's just this interesting dance of the longing for dignity, because we know that that's something that is designed in us. And the reality of just the fallenness of our world and the ugliness of it all at times, and there's this really amazing, to understand the theology of man, where man fits into God's scheme of understanding the world. You've got to understand this interplay that is always going on, this dance between dignity and depravity, that we were designed for dignity, and there's yet the impact of sin in our lives. And that I heard it once described as, it's like a junior high band playing Beethoven. There's something beautiful in the design and something horrific in the application. And so our topic today will be the theology of man, understanding kind of what God might have for us to understand about how he made us, why he made us, what our purpose is in life. I mean, so many of the questions, what do we do? What makes a life meaningful? What makes a life purposeful? You'll find God has some things to say about that. So with that as our introduction, we always start with something more important than information. We're supposed to start with relational things, and so why don't we take a few moments and share prayer requests and all those sort of things, and then we'll pray together. So anybody have any prayer requests or anything going on? Skylar broke his leg, so he was not cooperating with our plan. So Skylar's doing okay. We're kind of tired. We're running on we're not running on empty, but we're definitely not. We're definitely not on full tanks of gas. But I think God will gives most of us enough. This is kind of the motto of this last couple of weeks for us. He gives you the amount you need for the ticket right when the train's leaving the station, and not a dollar too much, and not a minute too early. So we've kind of experienced that a lot. So even this morning, as I was leaving the hospital, told him that I'd be back in about an hour and a half. There was a need for me to stay for a little bit longer, and I thought, Scott, you just are not cooperating with this entire plan. But anyway, it is interesting when he's not doing well. He does call for dignity. Dad, don't go, but then within 30 seconds, he's demanding and trying to get the nurses to give him free shiny things. And it's like, how do you flip back and forth like that? And we'll talk about how that happens, because we all do that in our lives. So any other prayer requests or praises or anything going on in your lives you want to tell us about?
When he gets out of the hospital, do you think he'd like to see an actual goat rodeo?
He would. He has lived many a goat rodeos in his life.
I'd like to see one. You talked about it so much.
So, but he is he's missing his mom. His mom's missing him a whole lot, and people are helping, and that's nice. And kids are helping. Kim spent a couple nights, and Breland spent a couple of nights. And have you ever made something? I mean, have you ever created something that didn't need to be created? That was maybe you made a plastic model when you were a kid, or you just did a craft, or can somebody give me an example? Somebody, you wrote a song that nobody will hear. Anybody ever just create something? Well, yeah, Terry is like, he's written 12,000 books and he does art and music, and so why do you do that?
Just something in me that has to come out and be expressed.
Yeah. Anybody else? When you create something, why do you do that?
I'd like to hear the answer. Our daughter has 1 million half-drawn pictures or plays written that she just decides to write one day, and there's a lot of them unfinished, but she likes to do that.
We reflect God when we're creative, but we'll talk about that in a second. But anybody else? Don,
Oh boy, I'm on one of those projects right now. When I finish, I call it now what? Because it's done, and you look at it, and you say, what in the world would you use it for? We've had some ideas. I do beading, okay? When we were growing up, we had bead strips around it for hats or belts. And I have quite a collection, but I'd be darned if I know what the heck to do with it now. Except collect dust.
I've got a couple of those in my life. Just things that there's just something in you. You just create it, and it's because there's something in you that was made to express who and what you are. Well, God did not need us. He did not create us out of need. He did not create us because he was lonely. He did not create us because he had to have us worship him. He didn't create us because he was trying to put together a puzzle and thought, here's some mice to put in my maze. He created us because one of the attributes of God, and one of those that we reflect, is that God is creative. God created the universe out of nothing. And there is something about the very nature of God that's nuanced and sees the color. And as I sometimes say, he paints behind the refrigerator. I mean, the details that no one else will see, God is radically committed to do, because that's who he is. You know, evolutionary psychologists can explain almost every attribute of man based on evolution. You know, why women tend to be more faithful in relationships than men. They've got that figured out because men have more sperm than women have eggs, which seems like an odd thing because I don't think most people would have known that, you know, just anyway. But evolutionary psychologists can answer all sorts of things about people based on their theory, except they can't understand why humans like art. They can't explain why the creativity, because they don't see the purpose in it. They can't say, well, they do this to get a reward. Do some people do art to get a reward? Yeah, but most of us don't. I mean, no one's ever going to listen to my songs that I've written.
Have you?
Well, Hey Baby, Meet Me in the Kmart Parking Lot was one of my favorite songs I've ever heard. It will never be heard by the world. Well, it's important that you know it's a misunderstanding of God when you say things like, well, I think it's really selfish of God to create beings for them to glorify him. When there's something about creativity that bursts out of a being and wants to create for the sake of beauty and delight and glory. And man was created by God, and it's important you understand, that's why you almost can talk about the theology or the doctrine of man, because it's really a separate category in creation. Everything else is good and everything else is beautiful, everything else is wonderful, but the creation of man has a couple things about it that are different than the rest of creation. Now, in one sense, everything that you create has a kind of a flavor of who you are. You know, probably every novel you write has a little bit of an autobiography piece in it. Almost every song you sing has some of your own story in it. If it's going to be a compelling song, it's going to have some of your own story in it. But there's something about when God made man, he described that as very good, and it's the first thing he said. All creation, speaks to his glory, but he said that man is created in his very image. So we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about that, knowing that the train we're on will take us to a perplexing place of the dance between depravity and dignity. That you were designed for dignity by God, to reflect his glory, to live for the high purposes of his glory, to express and say something about the very nature of him. We'll talk about what it means to create in his image and likeness. It's kind of funny, that phrase is used a lot now, image and likeness, in the world of sports. God used that phrase earlier than the NIL people did in sports. So God did not create us because he was lacking or needing anything. He wasn't lonely. He did not need someone or something to bring him praise or to bring him glory. But he still chose to create us. And that does bring him glory, like all creation brings glory to the creator of it. The fact that we were created for God's glory, everyone who is called by my name, I created for my glory, Isaiah 43:7. Although the fact is supposed to give our lives significance, what is it theologically? Remember, we're trying to be real simple in our theology here. What difference does it make that God created us for his glory? That gives you purpose. There's an ultimate dignity about you. There's an ultimate importance about humanity because we're created for God's glory. We weren't created for some menial task, but a beautiful eternal task. And so that gives you purpose. That gives you purpose if you're, no matter what job you have in life, no matter how meaningless or purposeless it may feel, if you realize that I've been created for God's glory, then that gives purpose. Remember, and even suffering, Don, the person who asked for prayer, the fact that we're created for God's glory gives a sense of purpose in suffering. So remember when the disciples saw the blind person and they asked the question we always ask, whose fault is that? The sin of the mother or the sin of the father? And Jesus said, it wasn't the sin of either one of them. It was for God could be glorified. And that's an odd, it's like, well, how could God be glorified? Because all of humanity is made to say something and to reflect the glory and the beauty of God's design. I have been enamored at the hospital how many people have become Skylar fans in the hospital. And in some sense, he's the least of all of them. He's probably the least smart person in the building. He's probably he's probably the youngest person in the hospital. But it's been amazing. Some of the special needs friends that go to this church have come to visit Skylar. And Kylan was there the other day, and they were talking, and I saw some of the nurses just hang around the outside of the room just to hear them talk to each other. It's like, it's my friend. What did you bring me? What are you here? When are you going to be better? And in that moment, Skylar was giving glory to God in a way that I don't understand completely. But that's all of creation. And so do you understand that this idea of the glory of God, you're created for his glory, gives you a purpose that transcends your abilities. but actually has the ability to touch the world. There's my kids we were all at the hospital one night, and there's a nurse that I think he's single. We're speaking in tongues. We need an interpreter. That's not true. If you don't come from a denomination that does that, you don't. Then you're out. I wasn't trying to be demeaning. I was just being funny. So this guy got off his shift, came in to say something to Skylar as he left, and he was caught up in my family. And there was my daughter and my daughter-in-law, and they were all just talking, and he just hung around. Because there was something about people that sense that their lives have a matter to them, they echo into eternity. It made him want to hang around a little bit. So, first point, as we were created to give God glory, that gives you purpose. It's not a selfishness on God's part. It's why you build things. It's nothing, when Cole writes a song or plays music, there's nothing about that it's not, he's not going, let's open the Cole show, I'm going to give you a t-shirt. There's something about it that, he's made to do that. That's his talent, his gifts. And so there's it's not selfish on God's part that he's given you purpose. It's not selfish on God's part that he's given you dignity. It's not selfish on God's part that he's created you to reflect who he is in this world. So the first thing is we're created for God's glory. Second thing I want to say is that we're created in his image. The meaning of the image of God. God only made one creature out of all of creation that he said was in his image. And what does that mean? The fact that man is in the image of God means that man is like God and represents God. The two words in Hebrew, one image and one likeness, one refers to how similar something would be. So we are like God in the fact that there's a similarity between some of our attributes and abilities, and there's something similar about it. And then also, the word likeness would be understood as that we represent. And so there's a way, and what does it mean to be created in the image of God? And there are theologians that have spent their entire career, literally their entire career wrestling with that one phrase, to be created in the image of God. What does that mean? Because we won't get quite that complicated with it. We'll kind of read it the way the Hebrews would have read it, by looking at those two words, of kind of created in the image and likeness. Image would be a similarity. Likeness would be the idea of a representative. So there are ways in which you could ask the questions: how is humanity like God? How are we like him? And how do we represent him? Does that make sense? So we're created for God's glory. We're created in his image. We're made like him, and we're made to represent him. So a couple of ways. One of the ways we are like him, if I could. There's spiritual aspects. We're spiritual beings. We're like him in the fact there's mental aspects. We have the ability to reason and think logically. We have the ability to learn. Some of our likeness of God is our creativity that I mentioned. There's sometimes you are reflecting God's glory when you create. That's why there's something about you that doesn't know sometimes why you do it, but you just do it and you'll like it, because that's very much like God. We're in the area of emotions. There's a likeness to God. There's a big difference because our emotions are just like our intellect is tainted by the fall. But those are all things in which that there's relational aspects. We are similar to God. And there might even be some this would be the least area of some physical aspects where there may be some ways in which, even though God is a spirit, there's a way in which when in Revelations it talks about some of the visions, there's some man-like characteristics that show up when they talk about that. So we're creating the image of God. The theology of man would say there's dignity in our design. And that would be just so beautiful. The way C.S. Lewis talks about it is, Lewis says that if I could see you the way you would be seen in glory, if somehow God broke the rules and allowed me to see Eddie the way that I would see him in glory, because that would be him without depravity at all, with just the dignity of how God created him, I would be tempted to worship him because of the beauty of the dignity of God. Well, I'm not tempted to worship Eddie. Though there are some things about him I really like. So what's gone wrong? And to understand the theology of man, or to understand the doctrine of man, is you have to understand the idea of the fall and depravity. And you need to understand how devastating that was to the beautiful design. In one sense, there's something wrong with everything on this side of heaven. And you kind of know that, don't you? You ever get your hopes up and say, yes, we'll really be happy when we have Thanksgiving together or Christmas together, or when we get this or we get that, or when this happens and this happens. And you are happy. And there's joy. The more you live in the dignity of who God designed you to be, the more joy there'll be. That's even a promise. But that depravity gets in the way. And nothing's quite what you hoped it'd be. And that dance between dignity and depravity, you've never run into a person whose in their very design God grins and delights. And the application of their sin causes that same God to sorrow. Every person you see. Now, as a counselor, what I usually do is I try to figure out, does that person need to be reminded of the dignity or reminded of the depravity? And there's a lot of counselors who kind of try to do a formula and say, well, everybody needs a lot to be reminded of their depravity. That's what everybody needs. And there's a lot of churches that what they focus on is, what we're starting today is before you get out of this door, you need to know about your depravity. And that's important. If you get your depravity, if you think you have dignity without Christ in you, then you're on a road to hell, literally. But if you have, and then there's some churches that seem to only talk about the dignity. And I think God would invite us to live in a tension of both of those being true. And every interaction you have with somebody, you ought to be thinking in the back of your mind, do they need dignity or depravity? I'm going to suggest to you that if you're going to err on the side of grace and on the side of dignity. If you're going to get your theology criticized, have it be criticized for the same reason Jesus' theology is criticized and Paul and Jesus were both criticized in their theology of being too grace-based. So if you're going to err slightly on the side of dignity, because I think most people don't have much problem realizing that they're kind of a mess. As a matter of fact, the people who act like they're the most together usually are the most messed up. My son was talking about somebody he was working with, and he said, this guy's a narcissist. And all he talks about is himself. And I said, why do you think he does that? And Pierce, I think, said something like, well, I guess he doesn't think anybody else will talk about him if he doesn't talk about himself. And it's underneath that bravo, that puffed up sense of self, there's really a very deflated person. Dignity, depravity. What do people need? So that's the idea of the image bearers of God. The last thing I want to make sure I cover in this the doctrine of man is that What is the purpose of man? I told you it was to give glory to God, but remember I said we're supposed to be light. We're kind of in likeness. We're supposed to represent Him. So one of our purposes of man is to represent God in creation. Just like a good king. A good king would probably put statues of himself all over the place a little bit, and let the kingdom remember who their king is. I remember when I was in the Ukraine years ago, almost all the statues in Kiev point toward Moscow because that's who they saw the kind of the mother country back then. The irony of them battling each other now. And there were statues everywhere. And it was because of Russia wanted to remind Ukraine that it was under its control and kind of remind, so they had representatives all over the place, the statues and the things. We are like that. God, His children, His people are His representatives. And we are to represent Him into the world. When people see you, and when you become a Christian, and you're part of that redemptive work of redeeming creation back unto God, you're a part of His work in this world. You represent Him. And so that way, in some ways, you're to be a steward. In some ways, you're to be. But those are the ways that you. Some of the ways in which you give glory to God. Just a couple of things. God's image is distorted but not lost because of sin. Redemption in Christ is a progressive recovering of more of God's image. After I become a Christian, God is changing me to reflect more and more, to win back, if you will, that lost image of who He is. That's why it frustrates me when sometimes in Christianity we settle for, in the Christian community, we settle for so little. There'll be somebody who's been a real gooberhead their whole life, and then as they get older, they come to church, they go, oh, that's just Bob. That's just Bob. And I want to go, if Bob's been a Christian all his life, there ought to be some change. He shouldn't become more of a gooberhead as time goes on. He should reflect the glory of Christ as he goes on. Kind of like Terry does. And Terry's so old, it's amazing. It's amazing that Terry even can come in and out of this room. So the fall of God's image is distorted but not lost. Redemption in Christ is a progressive recovering of more of God's image. At Christ's return, there will be complete restoration of God's image. Can you imagine? My son Skylar will be fully clothed in his right mind that day. There's nothing in this, and I use this word accurately, there's nothing in this damned earth that is worth the grin that comes on my soul when I think about the day that he'll be fully clothed in his right mind, complete. So those are some of the aspects of what it means to be an image bearer of God, that we represent Him. Let me give you. I dropped my book that had that thing marked on it. Let me find it back, and I'll. So responsibilities as creatures in God's image. We are made to represent Him on earth. And so that, as representative on earth, we're also called to take care of His land, have dominion over. We're supposed to, as image bearers of God, to represent the King of the universe. We have a responsibility to help restore His people and His land to what they originally were. Therefore, we have great hope and respect for all people, regardless of their state. They, like us, are a cumulative combination of God's infinite, wise, and skillful creation. And they have the potential to return to the beauty with Jesus Christ in them, the image of the invisible God, by turning away from their sin and turning to their Creator. So we should be the people that have hope because we know a God who restores and we represent him. We should be the people that have joy because we know a God who created and deeply loves, and we represent him. Representing God is not pretending. Representing God is getting to know him better and better to where you reflect who he is to others. So we will joyfully work toward the goal of redemption, and we will give God the glory that we were created to bring to him in the first place. The doctrine of man. You are. What would be what's that old quote? You're worth more than you could ever imagine, and you're much more depraved than you ever thought you were. There's a way in which I am more valuable and have dignity in a way that should scare me, and I'm much more selfish and depraved than I can possibly imagine. And that total depravity and that beautiful dignity dance together with Christ in us to change us, to grow us, so that we might reflect his glory by the way we love each other and love him. Remember, it was John Calvin who said there's dual knowledge. You can't know God without knowing man, and therefore yourself. And you can't know yourself without knowing God. Because we're created in his image, there's dual knowledge that you learn as you grow in knowledge of both of those things. Does that make sense? So just on a practical basis, what I'd love for you to do this week is kind of go out with that sense of always, if you keep your eyes on it, you'll always see it. You'll see this dance of creation between dignity and depravity, between beauty and despair, between hope and loss. And you'll see that being played out almost in every interaction you have every day. Be a dignity fairy this week. Go out and offer as an image bearer of God, as his representative that looks a little bit like him in a certain way. Go out and offer that dignity to people who don't have it. And to some people, you may need to offer some correction of and help them see their depravity. Well, let me pray for us. Father, thanks. Thank you that you made us. I mean, what an interesting thing to even say to you. Thank you for making us. For making us in such a special way, different than the angels. Different from all of the rest of your creation. Something that you really do delight in. Because we have certain ways that we look like you and certain ways that we represent for you. Wow, you've trusted us with so much. We humbly thank you for that. Be with us this week as we try to let this not just go into our heads, that we would become stuffy people, and not just go to our hearts, so it would be emotion, but it would go to our feet and we'd be doers of the word and not just hearers alone. We pray in your son's name. Amen.